In the chair today is Dr. Michael Eburn. Michael Eburn is an associate professor at the Australian National University. Michael, welcome to the EPC. You're a lawyer by profession, you're an academic specialising in emergency law, but you're also an emergency volunteer, an academic, if you like, who's not afraid to get his hands dirty.
That's right. I started my volunteering as a St John Ambulance cadet way back at the age of 13. I've served with St John Ambulance, then very briefly with New South Wales Ambulance, and now with New South Wales State Emergency Service. So I've tried, that's what's led me to my academic interest, having been in the services when I took a job at a university and had to find areas that I was interested in to research. It was a natural fit. But being a volunteer still keeps you grounded, keeps you in touch with people who are out there doing it, gets me out there occasionally at the scene of a flood or other emergency, so you know what you're talking about, so you've got a sense of what's actually going on.
So a degree of research is informed by your volunteering?
Absolutely. It helps me understand the issues, but also helps me understand the language and have discussions with my colleagues, yeah.
Well, let's move on to talk about some recent emergencies that have taken place in Australia. Here we tend to think about the Queensland floods.
Yeah. We
think too about the wildfires that seem to be an annual event in Australia. You've told us that on average 6 people a year die in wildfires, bushfires in Australia. That would indicate to some people that the emergency services in Australia simply aren't learning the lessons from these annual events. Every year, 6 people continue to die as a result of these fires.
I think a number of things have to be borne in mind there. It's not every year 6 people die, it's on average 6 people die, and that's since taking figures from 1901 through to 2009. They tend to die, rather unfortunately, in peaks, so we have tragic, large events. And of course the biggest one was the Black Saturday bushfires of 2009 that killed 173 people. And that was Australia's worst fatality. So in an average year, in fact, the death toll will be lower, down to 0, but punctuated by catastrophic, overwhelming events. The critical question, I think, though, is does that prove that the agencies have learned the lessons or have not learned the lessons? What those figures show, and there are other figures that have been produced about building loss, is that in fact the losses are amazingly consistent, notwithstanding that the population numbers are growing. So we're getting a bigger population, often living in more fire-prone areas as people move on to the edge, the urban edge, what the United States friends would call the wildland-urban interface. And yet in fact the risk of dying or house loss is not going up substantially. So clearly we're being matched by capacity in firefighting and emergency response. The other thing is to ask, how would we know whether we've learned the lessons? And the critical question there is, what are we meant to be achieving? If your objective is to have a system where no one will ever die in a wildfire, I think that's overly optimistic. People die in wildfires perhaps because the lessons haven't been learned by the emergency services, but also because the lessons may not have been learned by the community or by people, or at some point when you're facing a dynamic, very fast-moving event, people have to make decisions, and sometimes they don't lead to an optimal result. It doesn't mean they didn't learn the lesson. It may not mean that the people who were making decisions weren't fully informed, prepared, doing their best, but doing all that doesn't guarantee a good outcome.
So why do we bother with having inquiries after the event? Why do we have royal commissions? Why do coroners take time and trouble to come up with recommendations to prevent people losing their lives in future incidents like this?
I think there are probably a number of reasons for that. I think one of the first problems in what you've said is when royal commissions start with the line, we are going to hold an inquiry to make sure this doesn't happen again, that they are overestimating their own ability, they are underestimating the problem, and they are leading the community into a false sense of security. if you think a Royal Commission is going to ensure that it never happens again, we're all kidding ourselves. We have...
Does this opinion of yours make you a popular figure in the emergency management business?
Yeah, I think it does, actually.
Does it?
Because my message to the emergency management in Australia is that, now I have to be careful and try and limit myself to my discipline as a lawyer, and people often don't understand the law, but that the law doesn't require or expect perfection. The law doesn't require or expect governments or their agencies, remembering that all our fire services are government agencies, to guarantee people's safety. What the law requires people to do is to take reasonable steps. Reasonable steps doesn't mean guaranteeing a positive outcome. And our emergency services can be quite reasonable, and it can still lead to less than ideal results, but we don't actually know what the ideal results are. If your objective is to minimise loss of life, the fact, and I don't mean to downplay the tragedy, but the fact that somebody has died doesn't mean you haven't minimised it. You might have saved, who knows, but you can never count the people you've saved. You can't, if you've got great rapid intervention, if you've got great arson prevention techniques, which our police are developing, and so you have a day of catastrophic fire weather and no fire occurs, it's very hard to say, clearly we learnt the lessons and we did a good job, see, there was no fire. The community might well say, well, what do you mean you did a good job? There was no fire. So saving lives is something that's very hard to quantify.
Let me put it in a UK context. In a rail crash where one person, I beg your pardon, where one person is killed, what you're saying is, yes, that is a personal tragedy, but actually the fact that the other 250 people on the train survived may well be a triumph of good planning, good management, and resilience generally.
I think that's right. Train crashes are different to bushfires in the sense that human beings have built all the infrastructure and put the trains on it and run it, and whether it's an aeroplane crash or a train crash, you also have a choice of stopping the train. Fires are going to start whether you like it or not, and you can't necessarily put them out. But I do agree in principle, and I think if you take the recent San Francisco plane crash as an example, there's that plane crash, human error in the crash, as I understand it. But 3 people died in that. Now that's a tragedy for those 3 people, but think of how many other people were on that plane, and think how far airline safety has come, and what I've heard about the performance of the crew, and the safety devices and the resilience and the structures that we've built into those aeroplanes that allowed all those people to survive. 3 people died is a tragedy. That the plane crashed is a tragedy and warrants investigation. I mean, what were the pilots doing? How did that happen? But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that, I'm not sure how many people were on that plane, but there was a lot of them, and they survived. When I get on a large aircraft, you genuinely think if this thing hits the ground, the chances of me surviving really can't be very high, but we're getting there.
Do you think inquiries focus enough attention on the positive aspects then of emergency response as opposed to the negative?
I don't think they do, and I think that's not necessarily the inquirer's fault. They're bound by their terms of reference, and that's a point about inquiries. They are not, particularly the Royal Commissions, they are not broad-ranging inquiries charged with investigating everything. They are given a defined terms of reference that limits their ability to investigate broader things. So, for example, a fire inquiry might have a limited, if any, ability to inquire into decisions that might have been made generations ago about land use planning and where we're going to build. That's not going to be their focus, it's going to be on this response. They start when they're called already in the mindset of this was a terrible tragedy that mustn't happen again. And so they tend to lose that ability to focus on the success stories, and I think that's a problem. On the other hand, if they just do that, then they could become self-congratulatory, and you lose also identifying what could be done better. There needs to be a balance ultimately. There needs to be recognition, and there usually is. In the Australian Royal Commissions, they'll always have a line about how much they value the services of the emergency services and how fantastic the volunteers were. But that gets your sort of opening line before it then goes into, but now let's look at what really went wrong. I'm mindful of
And as part of that process, Michael, of course, individuals are held to account, and these experiences, standing before an inquiry, can be pretty daunting.
They can be devastating.
Because of you know, the adversarial nature of an inquiry and the role of the lawyer. And you yourself are a lawyer.
I am. I'm a member of the bar. So I'm a barrister.
Do you think that these inquiries should be conducted in that adversarial fashion?
No. I think that is a downside of them, and I think it's interesting that a number of the inquirers have said the same. So particularly the coroner into the 2003 Canberra fires, the coroner investigating the 2005 South Australian fires, and the Royal Commissioners in the 2009 all made varying degrees of commentary about how they were trying not to be an adversarial process, but sometimes it was just difficult not to fall into that trap. Now the Canberra coroner thought it was the lawyers who fell into that trap. The South Australian coroner cautioned himself. He said, I have to be mindful that I shouldn't blame anyone, though in these inquiries it's easy to explore every minutiae and you can always find fault by someone. But it is true, certainly in our inquests and inquiries, after the major events, you have to remember that a fire brigade, for example, will be appearing before a coroner fairly regularly. Coroners investigate fires and deaths. So they investigate the bread and butter work of a fire brigade. So fire officers are going to be before the coroner, but mostly nobody's questioning what the fire service did. They just want to know, was the house alight when you got there? Was the person dead when you got there? How long did it take to respond? Just so they can put the whole thing in context. No one's really questioning the fire services. It's after these catastrophic events like 2009, 2003 that they're the centre of attention. Now, it's a difficult problem. People who are leading...
You could take lawyers out of the equation, could you?
Well, you could, and let me come to that. What I was going to say is it's a difficult problem in the sense that if there have been, I don't want to say errors made, if there have been judgments made that have not led to optimal results, they should be identified. Whether you want to call them an error or not depends on what you expect. But equally, I think we need to recognise the work that's done. Yes, there could be ways of doing it without the lawyers in it, and that's something that colleagues and I at the ANU are hoping to be able to do some further research on into some alternative inquiry methods. We're interested in looking at the aviation industry, because the aviation industry at least claims to have a no-fault inquiry system. The aviation industry requires, more than encourages, requires reports of near misses. So an aeroplane nearly crashes will get reported and investigated. So we'd like to see if that's a model. Certainly in Australia, the medical profession is moving to what they call open disclosure, where they're encouraging medical practitioners to openly report mistakes and near misses, to be open with patients, to move to deal with the issue in a less adversarial sense. The United States has the US Wildland Lessons, I can't remember the title now. Anyway, a Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Centre. There you go. The US Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Centre. Certainly interested in exploring how they're doing it, because the interesting question for me from a centre like that is how do they maintain the public confidence that they're doing an investigation, a rigorous investigation into a fire, and it's not merely the fire services investigating themselves. Because we know that if that's how it's perceived, it won't work. Police services...
There has to be an independent perspective.
Police services suffer from that all the time. Yeah. Now, to come back to your question about why are these things called, that's one of the fears, is that royal commissions are called when you want to make sure you have an absolutely independent investigation. Historically, royal commissions have been used for a variety of purposes, like advising government on policy issues. But one of the critical things that royal commissions have is compulsory powers to require a person to come and give evidence and produce documents. So they're very good at revealing corruption, revealing things that people don't want to have revealed. The problem is when you start using those as an inquiry into a bushfire, it at least creates the impression that you already think that somebody wants to hide something, that the fire service isn't going to be honest and upfront, that someone's got something to hide. We've got to use these compulsion powers. We've got to force people to give evidence or produce documents because we're really going to discover what they're hiding. That's not my experience of the fire and emergency services. Now, maybe it's true, but it's not my experience. So you're already putting everybody up in into this environment that creates an expectation that something went wrong, that there's something hidden that's got to be found.
So how do we best serve the public interest in this matter?
Well, as I said, my colleagues and I at the ANU are hoping to do some research looking into that, and I've mentioned 3 models we want to look at. One of my colleagues, Professor Dovers, has also come up with a suggestion that he thinks what we need to do is have a very quick inquiry where you just try and identify the issues and then create specialist panels that go off and look at the individual issues rather than try and have one inquiry with one limited set of commissioners, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3, trying to deal with the whole matter so that experts can deal with each particular issue and then come back to provide some sort of synthesis report. So that's another model that we don't know if that will work, but that's something we'd like to be exploring. Our view is certainly, though, that the model we've got is not particularly effective. And even if it is effective at what it discovers, it comes at a very high cost. And the very high cost is to the emergency services. If your house has just been burnt down or your family has died, you might not think that's a big issue. But in a country like Australia that absolutely depends on its volunteers, if we're going to have an inquiry system that they don't trust, then we run the system of not having fire and emergency services because we depend on our volunteers. Volunteers might be willing to turn out to respond, they'll give a weekend or 2 or 3 days to go and respond to a fire. They're not very keen to give up the next 10 years following that, appearing before courts and judicial inquiries. We have to find a balance that reveals what has to be revealed after these events, but without sacrificing the emergency services along the way.
And that presumably is a consideration too, as we look to implement policy around community resilience, making in this country our communities more resilient, taking more responsibility for their own emergency planning and response. That would be, if they felt that they were going to be held to account in that kind of adversarial context, you would see that being a disincentive.
Why would anybody volunteer? That's right. And certainly in Australia, that's a fundamental issue as part of our community resilience. Our fire brigades, our state, every state and territory has a state emergency service which is charged with responding to floods, storms, that sort of event. But they're nearly all volunteer services. Well, that is your community resilience. That's people in that town have joined up. If they begin to think they're not supported, that's going to be a threat. I should add, as an aside, only to give the other side, they're more supported than they often feel. They're terribly afraid, they report to me, that they'll be sued and they'll be liable. There's no suggestion of that. No volunteer is going to be individually liable for any of their actions. In fact, the fire services aren't either. There have been a number of high-profile cases against the Australian Fire Services, suing them for negligence over the way they've responded to a fire. So far, none of those cases have been successful. So liability in that very lawyer's language, having to pay out money in damages, that's not the issue. That's a fear. A lot of people have that fear, but the answer to that fear is to convince them that's not a risk. They're not being sued, but they are appearing before something that looks and feels awfully like a court. And that's a damaging prospect too.
Michael, at the outset of this interview, you spoke about your early role as an emergency volunteer, but you are now primarily an academic. And you work in this emergency management and response field.
That's right.
What steps do you take to make sure that the people, the end users, the practitioners, find the work that you're doing engaging, valuable and relevant?
Fundamentally what we do is we talk to them, we work with them. Now our research for the last 3 years has been funded by an organisation called the Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre, and cooperative research centres in Australia are a model where the government as research funder, the universities and end users come together to make sure that what they produce is of relevance and importance to the people who are going to use it. There are many CRCs. Ours was the Bushfire CRC, and so our end users were Australia's Fire and Emergency Services. So we've been liaising with them. We've had end users appointed to the research projects to make sure that what we're doing has been relevant and useful to them. That project has recently come to an end and we're negotiating now for a new research project with a new CRC, the now Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. Assuming that all goes according to plan, then that will be the same. We will have end users, we will be working very closely and liaising with those people who most benefit from the research we do. It's important to stress that they don't control the research because they're our end users. They don't get to call the shots. We don't write research outputs to suit them. That would be academically inappropriate. But we certainly try and make sure that what we're researching is dealing with issues that are important to them and that the research is of some practical use to them. So we have quite a close relationship with our colleagues in the emergency services, and we hope to continue that.
Michael, thanks for taking part in this interview. Thanks for coming to the college and sharing your experience with the people here this evening. On behalf of all those who've had the opportunity to listen to you, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.